Hello and welcome to Writing Today. In this episode, I'm going to be giving you 10 tips that I recommend for writing a thriller story. As always, you can read this article on my website, thepennedsleuth.com. There's a link to that in the description below. And if you haven't yet already, I recommend enrolling in my free course on how to write an in-depth fantasy world. This is a course that will run you through the steps to create a more immersive world, not only during your planning process, but also during the writing process as well. So if that sounds like a course that you're interested in, be sure to check it out. Now, the thriller genre is one of my favorites. If you've checked out any of my short stories, you know that I often fall back on thriller stories, because I like to create suspenseful scenes and monstrous creatures. It makes for a lot more engaging story, as the protagonist is constantly under threat. If you look at the popular books today, you'll notice that a lot of them are thriller stories, most of them being thriller mystery novels, but you often find the dark fantasy with thriller elements, or a thriller in space, that sort of thing. Readers like to root for a protagonist in a tough situation, and you'll find that in thriller novels, the situations don't get any tougher. With that said, let's get into the top 10 tips I have for writing a thriller story. Starting with the very first one, which is to keep the reader guessing. Personally, this rule is a must no matter what scenario. I typically write thriller and horror stories, as I said before. Even when writing a lighter novel, I still find myself going back to the dark void for inspiration. It usually suggests I make an unknown threat and make it scary. Yet, when I write suspenseful scenes, I don't give the reader any hints. Only I know what goes bump in the dark in my story. Yet they are better off, or should I say worse off, not knowing. The human mind can think up something far worse than anything you can come up with when you're feeling inspired. Of course, that doesn't mean that they will. This is why when writing a suspenseful scene, I put the reader to work by giving them reasons to be scared of something, even if they're not sure what that something is. I let the reader know there is a threat, an invisible danger. I create distrust, I create fear, but I hold off on who or what the threat may be. In other words, I keep them guessing. I have the darkness of the reader's mind pondering what could be so evil, so dangerous. And sometimes the monster or threat that I have in mind is a lot scarier than the reader thought, which is great. But if it isn't as scary as the reader thought, or less so, I still have that added fear that they felt until the big reveal. This is something that all thriller writers keep in mind, be they a beginner writer or an experienced thriller writer. There's nothing more scary than the threat of the unknown. Tip number 2 is don't force suspense. It's simple in concept but difficult in practice. When writing any scene, be it suspenseful or not, you should never force yourself. However, it goes doubly so for the suspense scenes. With other scenes, you might mess up a description or create a hollow dialogue. Unless it is a major part of your story, it's no big deal and could even be rectified if it is too glaring of a problem. However, with a suspense scene, every detail goes a long way towards establishing the right ambience and the right emotional states of the characters. All this is to get the reader feeling the fear. Unlike the previous examples, if you make a little mistake in a suspense scene, you tend to break the immersion and you tend to take away the fear just like that. So that makes it a lot more difficult to fix, and most likely you'll end up rewriting the scene to avoid that problem. A great way to avoid this problem is simply not force yourself and write another scene instead. Or at the very least, wait until you have the mentality and inspiration to write that suspenseful scene. Now, you might have some great suspenseful scenes going. Some might have you even looking over your shoulder. However, everything grows tiresome if you experience it long enough. Just like listening to a song on repeat, constant suspense soon loses its edge, its power. The solution is to give the reader breaks. It's a simple rule but an important one. Even if your plot is centered around a character stuck in a haunted house from beginning to end, there needs to be moments of respite. Moments where the character can take a breath, where the reader can take a breath. Every great thriller plot has these moments, the moments to think about what has happened, to take a moment to feel safe and calm, and then to take that away again when you introduce the next suspenseful scene. Tip number 4 is to use anti-climax. While many suspense scenes end with the reveal of danger or the main threat to kick the suspense up into an action scene, it pays to have the suspense scene end anticlimactically. Think of it like a red herring for the reader's anxiety. Is that the monster, the killer? Is this where the character gets hurt or worse dies? Or is it, yes, it was just a cat that popped out of nowhere and ran off? A surprise to be sure, but certainly not an axe-wielding psychopath bent on carving a bloody path through the protagonists. These moments not only add to the mystery of the antagonist, but it also adds to the insecurity of the characters and perhaps the reader as well. It will make that moment when you reveal the threat all the more surprising. Tip number 5 is to slow suspense down before the sudden suspense. Great writers and even great directors understand that the character isn't immediately in danger when they enter the creepy cave or the horror house. Instead, there is a gradual build-up, some time to investigate, reflect, and learn. Once this is done, some indications of danger make themselves known. And fast suspense is when the threat is making itself known by signs that it leaves behind, that it's making actions towards the protagonist. The antagonist is making their move, so it is during these moments that the suspense rapidly builds up, and then it's very easy to create a break in the moment where the antagonist reveals themselves, or to create an anticlimax, as I said before, to give some relief. You don't have to do this in the beginning stages of your novel because there isn't really a threat present enough for the suspense to build that fast. But it is important to lay down this foundation of suspense in the beginning before you start throwing your threats at the protagonist. Speaking of which, tip number 6 is to make an interesting antagonist. The most captivating of thrillers had some iconic antagonists. It's easy enough to create a simple threat, a realistic one, such as a criminal breaking into a house, or a wild animal pursuing the protagonist in a forest. However, an interesting antagonist makes the story more thrilling. Now, one makes the antagonist interesting by giving them an advantage or a unique way of doing things. And there are many ways you can give the antagonist a unique way of doing things. For example, you could have them leave a calling card, or perhaps signs of their arrival. Perhaps they only strike at night. Perhaps they leave a little figurine on the fireplace. Things like that. There are so many weird and interesting ways that authors have come up with to give their antagonist a unique trait. A unique way to separate them anyway from the other antagonists that are common in thriller stories. And of course it stretches further to the unique way they dress, to the unique way they say things. These sort of personality traits also separate them from common antagonists. Yes, a great way to surprise your reader is to hit them with a plot twist. It could be the antagonist was closer than they thought, or the protagonist was the killer all along, or even smaller twists along the way that helped pass the suspicions around. Plot twists are fun to write, and they can have an impact on the reader when they're done right. However, the more convoluted the twist, or the more twists you have, can lead to contradictions or no impact at all. But by the same token, you don't need to include a plot twist in your story to make it a good thriller story. Plot twists are common in almost every form of fiction, so if you want to include a plot twist in your story, you're going to have to plan it carefully, especially if it is a complicated one. But that doesn't mean you have to include a plot twist. There are many stories of every genre, not just thriller genres, that simply don't include these plot twists to keep things interesting. It's not the kind of story that author wanted to tell, and that's perfectly fine. Tip number 8 is to be clear about the stakes. A protagonist doesn't conflict with the antagonist in the thriller just for peace of mind. There need to be stakes when it comes to thriller stories. The most popular is the protagonist is just trying to stay alive. When you have a dangerous killer or monster hunting the protagonist, their primary concern is to escape or defeat their antagonist for the sake of their soul. Of course, there are other examples where the protagonist wants justice, or they want to take something from the antagonist, or the conflict escalated from something small to something big and scary. It's never just conflict for nothing. For example, let's say your protagonist is simply trying to survive in your thriller story. You can remind them of their mortality and what's at stake if they get caught by injuring your protagonist, or you could have another character attacked or killed by the antagonist. This will also remind the character and the reader of the protagonist's mortality and that this antagonist means business. This tip can be taken two ways and it depends on the kind of writer you are. It could mean you need to include more action scenes or you need fewer relaxed scenes. A lot of authors can break the suspense by lingering too much in the scenes that break the ambiance. If there are too many happy moments throughout the story, it is easy to tone down the fear and suspense that you're trying to create in your thriller novel. The best way to figure out if you have too many relaxed scenes or too few action scenes is to check the pacing of your novel. Does it feel like the scary scenes are dulled by the scenes that transpire before or after them? If so, you might want to break them up with a little more action scenes or cut some relaxed scenes out. Well, you do that by putting in small dark moments or nightmares for the protagonist. It could be that the protagonist witnesses a disturbing scene that doesn't really affect them that much, but it does remind them and sets the tone and reminds the reader that this is a thriller novel, that things aren't so hunky-dory in the world. All of these happy moments will work together, not only to break up those happy moments, but to help lay down a foundation of dread for the reader until the action scenes actually transpire. Many qualities can make your character strong. Essentially, you want to give them the traits that the reader finds compelling, that help them survive the events of the story. You can make your character likable from the beginning to make them compelling, or have them develop throughout the story into a strong protagonist, which is compelling in itself. You can also give your protagonist skills and abilities if they are dealing with a threat that requires some sort of speciality. For example, your antagonist could be an animal-like monster, and your protagonist could be a hunter or zookeeper. The hero then uses their experience with animals to help them survive this unusual threat. That is why in thriller mysteries, the protagonist tends to be either a detective, a journalist, or just the curious type, because they go out of their way to look for clues, to piece things together, to uncover the truth. If you're still unsure of what to do here, simply think about what traits would help them in the story or make them a lot more interesting to the reader. Now, as you know, thriller stories come in many forms. There are thriller stories about aliens in space, psychopaths, about monsters, and then there are some more fantasy-esque stories, which are like dark fantasies. This is a genre that is spread over many themes, but another way to divide it down the middle is to establish two types of threats. You have the thrillers where there is a more physical threat, be it a monster or killer. And then you have the thrillers where it's more psychological, where the events of the story are what plague the protagonist, and it's the protagonist overcoming inner demons that is the real thriller story. Of course, many writers and movie directors and artists would like to depict these inner demons as physical creatures or threats to make the story a bit more compelling and interesting, as a way of saying that the protagonist's mind takes what's inside and translates it to something in the physical realm. And personally, I like surreal themes to most stories that I read, science fiction, fantasy, and so on. So creating a psychological thriller tends to be my go-to instead of having a direct physical threat. With a psychological thriller, I can create so many surreal themes. I can create those anti-climax moments where is it a real threat or is it in your head sort of thing. And these tips help me to manage all of this during the writing process, to figure out what I want and how to present it. And if you are experienced with the thriller genre, what advice would you give to beginners looking to write a thriller story? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you want to check out more of my work or perhaps enroll in some of my free courses, you can find that all on my website, thepensedsleuth.com. There's a link to that in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, good day, good night, and happy writing.